Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of our problem gambling series on the GI Huddle. So far, we've aimed to bring you honest and thought-provoking insight, and we hope you've gained a lot from watching the first three episodes. We're aiming for more of the same with Perrin Carey in our final installment. Hi, Perrin. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Tim. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the things that we're going to discuss. Might challenge a few people, including you and me.
Certainly, a pleasure to have you on. For our viewers who might not know, we spoke a few months ago when it was still locked down, so it feels like yesterday, essentially. But we spoke about responsible gambling issues for Gambling Insider magazine, and that article is still available to read on gamblinginsider.com, just to throw that out there. But today we're kind of, for our audience, we're looking to follow up on that, and it's obviously part 4, the final part of our problem gambling series. So I think what would be useful for our viewers, just an intro question. Perrin, can you tell us a bit about what you currently do, your work and research, and also, if you want, a bit about your experience in the gambling industry?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. I guess from my perspective, my experience in the gambling industry, first of all, that might kind of place a reason of why I might even be here. I was recruited into Stride Gaming PLC, which obviously is now Rank Group. And for those of you that remember, obviously one of their subsidiaries, Daub, was fined 7 million back in 2018. And my role was to essentially resolve that issue. So my experiences within the gambling sector are essentially to resolve financial sanctions from the UK Gambling Commission. My reason for, I guess, being pulled into the gambling sector was my 20 years of experience working within regulatory compliance, governance and risk management in other sectors, including financial services and actually international education. And what am I doing now? About a year ago, set up a startup business focusing on governance, risk and compliance, but using research in order to try and interrogate these essentially concepts that we talk about. So what is compliance? What is governance? And I think these are some of the things that I hope that you and I are going to sort of talk through today, and how we can begin to try and move these forwards, but using an evidence-based approach. I hope that helps.
Yep, absolutely. And as you say, what we discussed before was, it was kind of, as you say, compliance, governance, organizational culture, these kind of things, and of course responsible gambling, which is affected by kind of all of these things. Since we last spoke, what have been some kind of maybe key developments and areas of your research in the last sort of few months?
Okay, so what we have done from our research is we've tried to look at what exactly governance is and how governance itself interfaces with this thing that we call compliance. And I know that sounds a bit kind of philosophical, but we believe it's really important because fundamentally we believe, and I think most people would agree, organizations are just a bunch of human beings gathered together for a particular purpose. And therefore, it's really, really important to bring that human element into these concepts of governance and compliance. And this has really been the cornerstone of the work that we've been doing over the last 12 months. And we've developed a piece of technology, which we call Govindicia, essentially governance indicators. And essentially, it's a piece of technology that helps us to get human data outcomes on the performance of governance within an organization and how that affects compliance. And it's an evidence-based research program developed into a piece of technology, and it supports organizations to improve governance and compliance outcomes, but using humans as the evidence base.
Yeah, all makes a lot of sense. An important area to kind of work in. And on that note, I think we can maybe delve into the first kind of meaty topic that something you've talked about before. Linked to your research, what you've said to me in the past is compliance doesn't really exist. Now, sort of we're laughing to that, and
Yeah.
someone might hear that and think, what on earth? What does that mean? Can you sort of tell us more about that?
Yeah. I think what I'm saying, in summary, is if we look at an organization that has regulatory obligations, we talk about this concept of, are we compliant? We raise that question. And I've had it posed to me many times, sitting in a boardroom, presenting my monthly or quarterly report as Chief Compliance Officer. Perrin, are we compliant? And as I thought about that question, month in, month out, quarter in, quarter out, I realized that actually my true response, if I was actually to answer, would be no, we're not. And the reason for that is actually because compliance itself is an idealistic outcome. Essentially, it says we are totally, completely, and utterly compliant. Actually, compliance, therefore, doesn't exist. It is something we aim towards, don't get me wrong, but it itself doesn't exist. So what does exist, and this is why it's quite important to acknowledge that compliance doesn't exist, is that therefore what does exist is non-compliance. And I think this really begins to then bring our focus back into, okay, so if non-compliance exists, how are we mitigating the reduction of that? How are we actually putting in place systems? And I mean systems holistically, not just policies, procedures, and controls, but what systems are we putting in place to reduce our levels of non-compliance? Because ultimately, that's the question. And I think my reason for raising the kind of statement and being slightly provocative is that it begins to get us to really think about what's the actual problem here. The problem is non-compliance. The problem is not compliance itself.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say that makes sense, but it's one of those that it makes you think, and certainly I can definitely see where you're coming from. In terms of this, I think something we spoke about in our previous interview, organizational culture really is key to this. And I know something else that you focus on is obviously governance, and sort of linking the two together. Something you've said is governance is kind of not that well understood and can ultimately be a troublesome topic. Can you maybe again expand a little bit more on this?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, okay. I don't really like the word governance because I think it steers us, ironically, because that's essentially what governance means, to steer. But the word itself steers us towards this idea of rules and frameworks and committees. And as a consequence, we've built over time, as a result of many kind of precursors, for example, Enron and other corporate governance failures, this codification of governance. And I think this is troublesome, not because I don't I don't agree with it, because I can see the benefit of it. It provides us a framework. But again, it just becomes another compliance outcome. So for me, when I go into an organization and I want to talk about this thing I call governance, I actually rephrase the question. And I actually say, okay, so what's your murmuration factor? As you can imagine, that gets a very confused look when I go into a boardroom. Murmuration is this wonderful spectacle that we see that starlings do when they flock together. And essentially, it's this wonderful kind of fluid, dynamic, constantly changing shape of this collective and cohesive group of birds. So what I think governance looks like, and what I think we should describe governance as, is murmuration. Because if we live in the most uncertain times that most of us have ever experienced, organizations are day by day looking at their own survival and how they're going to manage that week by week, month by month. Where are we going to be? 5 years' time is irrelevant. Even 1 year time is almost irrelevant. Where are we going to be next month? Some organizations, where are we going to be next week? This creates a really volatile environment. So actually, rigid frameworks from the concept of governance are not going to serve us well. What we actually need is very fluid and dynamic governance frameworks. And for me, the best visual representation that I have of that is murmuration. So what we do is we actually measure and quantify using human data how well an organization is murmurating. We don't measure governance, although you could call it that. We actually measure how well an organization is able to murmurate.
So if we were to kind of break this down in a practical sense, and obviously in this kind of wider conversation we're having, responsible gambling, and obviously this is part of our problem gambling series, how does that concept kind of affect, let's say, an operator in the pandemic, how they're sort of interacting with their customers, and what systems they have in place to sort of reduce gambling harm?
Absolutely. Fantastic question. Okay. So I think the first thing, let's go back to our idea of mitigating non-compliance, first of all. So all of our regulated community are essentially obliged to comply with those regulations. We know that that isn't going to be perfect. And I think in the conversation that you and I had in our previous interview, we talked about this idea of mitigating risk being the priority. Outward risk and inward risk. And what I mean by that is, obviously, customers pose a risk to organizations because they may be involved in financial crime. Yeah. But equally, organizations pose risks to their customers. And obviously, this is the social responsibility piece that we talk about. So how does all of what I've said previously fit in to this particular issue? In order to mitigate risks, what we tend to do, and I think it's appropriate, is to implement policies, procedures, and controls. And those policies, procedures, and controls align to the risks that we believe we have. And that's perfectly sensible. Yeah. If you have a risk, what's the risk? How can we reduce that risk? Let's put in a process that means that we're going to follow that process and mitigate the risk. And don't get me wrong, that works. But it doesn't create a very fluid and dynamic organization, because by nature, policies, procedures, and controls are regimented and they are built around a very static framework. What we're learning from organizations that are able to be fluid and dynamic is that they're shifting, they're not removing, but they're shifting some of their focus away from policies and procedures and controls, which is essentially a process-based decision-making. Yeah? And they're moving towards a values and purpose-based decision-making framework. Now, values and purpose, we know from the research, are absolutely paramount for the success, long-term success and sustainability of an organization. It also builds the foundation of this thing that you mentioned before, which we call culture. There's a wonderful description of culture that I think I mentioned to you before by Seth Godin. And he simply says, culture is people like us do things like this, which begs two questions. Who are people like us? And what do we do? And that is culture, whether you're inside a gambling operator, whether you're part of a book club, whether you're the member of a football team. These are just groups of humans. And within those groups of humans, we have culture. It exists everywhere. And what's interesting and what we find is that organizations, therefore, that have both process-based decision-making and also values and purpose-based decision-making, and they map those very closely and align them, that those organizations are much more dynamic, they're much more agile, they're much more able to operate in times of uncertainty. And this is where we talk about a murmuration factor. How agile and how able is your organization to respond to the uncertainty that's around you, but at the same time, ensure that you mitigate the risks of non-compliance.
I've got a short follow-up question. Not doesn't mean a short answer, but a short question from me. How can a gambling company or the industry more widely do that and become more fluid and ultimately pose less of a risk to its players as a result?
Okay, really, really interesting question. The research that we're doing is beginning to deliver some interesting outcomes. The research that we're doing with organizations is telling us that those organizations that are more purpose-led and more values-led are actually resulting in a less dehumanized approach to business. Now, what's interesting is we attribute names, we attribute particular tags to our stakeholders. So, when we talk about governance, we talk about stakeholders, we talk about our suppliers, we talk about, and I think what we're finding in our research is that organizations that view those stakeholders as groups of humans, they actually engage with those groups with more empathy, more understanding of their circumstances. And I think what we're seeing in those that are enhancing their social responsibility to a degree which goes beyond just regulatory conformity is that customers are actually seen as human beings. And this is why there is a connection between seeing customers as human beings and being slightly less procedure and control driven. Because if you're procedure and control driven, actually your decisions are not being made about individual humans. Your decisions are being made as a consequence of process. Whereas if you bring in an element of values-based decision making, so think about your corporate values, bring those values into the decision making process, then actually you bring the human back into the decision making process. And we realize from the research that's emerging from us and also from other areas around the world, look at the work that the FCA is doing in the UK within financial services, they're seeing the same thing. If there's an emerging culture within an organization that humanizes their customers, actually the decision making that goes on about those customers actually becomes more compliant, because the customer is seen not just as a result or at the end of a process, they're actually seen, and there's empathy that exists between the decision maker and the customer. I hope that kind of makes sense. There's a lot of stuff going on there, so I do apologize if I'm not coming across clearly.
No, I mean, hopefully to our viewers it's clear. To me, that's clear, and I guess a point it raises for me personally is something I probably mentioned to you again a few months ago. Sustainability, really, because I think CEOs and CFOs are under a lot of pressure, and the human thing to do, as you say, the more compliant thing to do is take a less dehumanized approach. But a CEO and a CFO will still have a business case to answer to, but ultimately, being responsible and less dehumanized, sorry, as you say, surely, in my view, that can only help financially, because a business is more sustainable that way.
That's what the evidence is suggesting, not just within the gambling sector, but if you look at other businesses, certainly within financial services as well. Businesses that are beginning to adopt this purpose and values-driven approach to creating their culture and supporting their decision-making are seeing less essentially dropout of customers. All right, so your engagement with customers becomes more human. Yeah, your decision making around those customers, in terms of obviously within the gambling sector, you look at the limits that you're providing for customers, you look at how those are fluctuating and changing, understanding the personal circumstances of those customers, and looking at obviously the information that's coming back from interactions. All of these things, understandably, are being embedded into process and into procedure. And of course, that has to happen. I'm not saying throw that out, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Of course, you need policies, you need processes, and you need controls. But you also need this values-based approach as well. because it supports actually a long-term sustainability of the relationship with those customers, with the people that are essentially paying you for the service that you provide, which is, a wonderful piece of entertainment. And it's really, really important that you create that long-term relationship with your customers. This idea of kind of, turning and churning your customers as quickly as possible. Actually, if you think about the financial long-term sustainability of that, it's not feasible. You will reach a dead end. There are a finite number of people within different jurisdictions. And the more you turn and churn, the less people you're going to have in order to have as your customers. It makes far more sense to develop a long-term, value-based relationship with your customers.
Yeah, I think a key point you make there is the entertainment factor. And it's a point the industry make a lot. And I personally feel, gambling and betting, even if you lose a bet, if you've got entertainment from that, that's the whole bottom line of the product. But like you say, I think it's more about actually reflecting that internally and maybe not just using kind of an operator using that as rhetoric, for example. We've talked about a lot already, but I've got a couple of final questions for you and quite forward-looking ones. And what we're talking about now is actually quite poignant, given there's a Gambling Act review sort of coming up. Well, it's sort of underway already in the UK. On that note, what is, in your view, is the future of regulation? I know that's quite a broad question, sorry, but
It is a broad question. Okay. When I try and look at the future of regulation, it's often useful to look outside of the sector that you're in. In the many dealings that I had with the UK Gambling Commission, it was very clear that they also look outside their own sector for, what are the emerging ideas within regulation? How are we going to move forwards and try and combat what we need to do, but at the same time have a forward-looking regulatory framework? So I know that there's a lot of interaction between the UK Gambling Commission and the Financial Conduct Authority, for example. If you look at the work at the Financial Conduct Authority, this is what the UKGC is looking at, you will see that they have, for the last 4 years, been really looking at culture, and they've been really looking at accountability. And I think we had a brief conversation about accountability and responsibility in our kind of previous chat, but there is a difference between them. So responsibility is essentially, I take on the responsibility for this task. So it's a task-orientated ownership. Accountability goes beyond that. Accountability takes responsibility for the outcome of that task. And what the FCA have been working towards, and what I can see as it emerges from the UKGC, is that accountability is something that they're very, very interested in and very keen, let's say, for operators to adopt and adopt fully. So if you look at the report, the enforcement report in 220 from the UKGC, you'll see that they talk about accountability. And they talk about the fact that accountability needs to be accepted more, not just at board level, but actually it needs to start drilling down and across our organisations. Because actually accountability helps decision making. Because if you're not just responsible for the process, you can, at the end of the day, you can go home and say, I followed the process. But if you don't think about what the outcome of that process is, then of course you remove yourself from what that outcome might be. So what the FCA are doing, and I know the UKGC have been talking about, even since I moved away from the sector, about a year ago, they were really interested in following up on this idea of accountability. And then the other aspect is culture. So I think we're going to see an increased focus on how organisations are instilling essentially a positive culture within their organisations and with their interactions with all of their stakeholders. So customers, third-party suppliers, etc. And this obviously then feeds into this idea of of how do you make decisions about those customers? How do you use the information that you have from your social responsibility interactions to make those decisions? How are you documenting that? And then you fall in this cycle of what's our culture, how are our decision making, and how are we accountable for those decisions. So I wouldn't want to be the one with a crystal ball, but the FCA have obviously introduced the senior managers reporting regime, which is essentially a list of individuals who are absolutely accountable and will be held accountable for decisions that are made within their organisations. And that is spreading. So that's a spreading framework. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see a similar framework being looked at and adopted across the gambling sector within the UK within the next 12 to 18 months. It's a way of embedding an improvements in culture. It's a way of instilling accountability vertically and horizontally within an organisation.
Yeah, as you've just described, needless to say, plenty going on in this area, and very parallel to the future of regulation. My very last question for you is, what's the future of compliance, and compliance in the way that we've spoken about it today? But I'd like to frame that in two parts. What's the future if what we've discussed is embraced, when it comes to culture, or all the topics we've discussed, and sustainability? And perhaps what is the future if companies just decide this isn't for me, we're going to carry on the way we always have been?
The last question is probably the easiest to answer, I guess. What would happen if you don't start adopting these approaches? I think what you'll find is that the regulator won't be particularly pleased. You'll find yourselves on the wrong side of the regulator, as we've seen with organisations in the recent past. And I think your sustainability will not be addressed. You won't be a sustainable organisation. One, you won't be able to adapt to the changing environmental frameworks around you, including the uncertainty that we now live in. But also you won't be able to respond to what's only going to get a more difficult and challenging regulatory space. With regards to compliance and what the future of that looks like, I think despite everything that I might say, I don't think the term's going to disappear. I think it's definitely here to stay, and that's obviously good. I think we just need to understand the difference between them. But I think what we're going to see is compliance is going to really have to address this concept of culture. Certainly within financial services, this is something that has been pushed probably for the last 10 to 15 years. I think they've made some progress, but I think there's a lot of progress to make. So I think compliance is something that's going to have to not only understand policies, procedures and controls and how you mitigate risks through that, they're also going to have to understand human behavior and why humans make decisions that we do. And we've touched on it a little bit today when we've talked about accountability. We've talked a little bit when we talk about values-based decision-making and the importance of that. But there's one other very small kind of addition that we really need to think about, and this is, as human beings, all of our decisions are actually driven by emotion and not by cognitive process. So although we might think that we're reasoning individuals, and generally speaking, we come across as being that, actually when we make decisions, 98% of the process or the actual decision itself occurs within the section of the brain that's responsible for emotion. And this is why making values-based decision-making enhances the role of compliance within organizations. Because if you make a values-based decision rather than just a process-based decision, you're engaging with emotion. And if you're looking at your customer as a human being, you're engaging with a values-based decision, you're emotionally connected with that other human being, even if you don't know who they are. So it improves your decision-making process and essentially makes you more compliant. So I think the future of compliance is still pursuing policies, procedures, controls. Absolutely, we need those. but I think it's really looking at human behavior, human decision making, and therefore bringing humans back into our decision making process.
Well, Perrin, thank you very much for all your answers and all the insights. Some really complex topics we addressed, and I'm sure our viewers will gain a lot from them.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be back and to be able to talk about the work and the research that we're doing.
No problem. Yeah, thanks for your contribution and all the best.
Thanks, Tim.
To all our viewers, thank you for listening to all 4 parts of our problem gambling series. We've spoken about the US side of affairs, the psychological impact, women gambling clinics, and organizational culture and compliance today with Perrin. For all the latest on the industry news and more on responsible gambling, be sure to visit gamblinginsider.com. Thanks for watching.